Hello, tubers! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And welcome to Coopersthaiadventures. Welcome back, folks. And today's topic, it's not so much money matters as it is about Remembrance Day. It's being recorded, this is on Saturday, which is Remembrance Day in Canada, and Veterans Day in the States. And I just thought I'd do a little story that my grandfather told me, who served in World War I. And initially, my dad was gone when my brother and I were like 4 and 3 years old. So my grandfather was kind of the father figure in our family and farmed in Puslinch, Ontario, near Guelph. And we would spend pretty well every weekend there, and all the summers and vacation holidays, we would go to the farm and basically spend time there. So it was mixed farming, and I do credit him with the good work ethic and building good moral character and ethics. So but anyways, a bit of history. The ancestors, McWilliams was their name, emigrated from England in 1838. And interesting story, and this is again from my grandfather. My grandfather was born in 1897. So I feel quite blessed because I was born in 1952, but I can say, hey, I knew people from the 1897, and now we're into 2023, and boy, you kind of spanned 3 centuries there. But anyways, the ancestors emigrated from England 1838 on a ship and landed in Toronto, Ontario. And at that time, settlers were, given free plots of land, 100 acres. And they just had to clear it because it was all bush. And at the time, my grandfather related how, there was no highways or rail systems. There was Indian paths, so you walked that to get to the town of Guelph at that time, and the land registry office to get your plot of land, let's say, being a lot in concession. It was 100 acres. So that occurred, and when the ancestor got to the supposed lot and concession, there was already a cabin on this lot. Boy, this was interesting, this story. And there had been 5 acres cleared, which in those days, if you cleared 5 acres a year and planted it, that was considered a good solid year. And so the settler that was there, there was no argument or dispute. They both went to the land registry office back in Guelph to ascertain, which one was in error. And it turned out that my grandfather, the ancestor, was at the right property where the settler that was there should have been. He was on the right lot, but he should have been one concession over. And what's interesting, in those days, the ancestor went with the gentleman and to the proper lot and helped him clear 5 acres and as well build a cabin. And that job was done before anything else on the home farm, let's say, so that each person had their 5 acres cleared and their cabins built. So talk about teamwork back then. And I guess, that was what you did to survive in those days. So, we're talking back in, 1840s area, 1838 is when they arrived. But so that was a very interesting story from my grandfather. It would have been my grandfather's grandfather that had done this. So, my grandfather, George Albert McWilliams, was born 1897, and grew up on that farm that the ancestor had settled. And at that time, they had accumulated about 200 acres. And it was a mixed farming, cattle, maybe 15 to 20 head typically, and maybe, 6 to 8 sows and some fattening hogs. And, you grew your vegetables and gardens, and you basically survived that way. And so I remember, and I quizzed my grandfather a lot. I was very curious back then. I was quite a young fellow. And, things, he had some interesting stories. But originally, I remember when the first TV came into the house, it was just the radio with the CBC, and Mr. Sinclair was on there broadcasting. But and I remember that radio, listening to it quite eagerly. But I also remember when the first TV was brought in, and my grandfather actually fell in love with baseball, like seeing it live. Sure, it was a game they might have played occasionally growing up, but to see it actually live in the professional leagues, that was quite something. And the other thing I remember about the TV set was 1969, and I would have been 17 at the time, and the United States had put a man on the moon, and we were watching that, and I remember distinctly my grandfather turned to me. He says, "Son, if I was your age and someone had said they'd put a man on the moon, they would have locked that guy up in the loony bin and thrown away the key." And I think his point was the things he had seen in his life. Telling me stories back then in Ontario, southern Ontario, the Indians were mobile, they were moving, they didn't have a concept of, deeds or land ownership or anything. And, that's interesting. But yeah, that was a memory he had said. And I got around, I would have been, probably 14 or 15 at the time. And I was querying him about, the World War I, which, how was that, Grandpa? How, did you, he says, well, he was born in 1897. So when the war started, he was only 16, I believe, and maybe a little too young to volunteer. And I remember the other thing he said the governments basically wanted the farms to operate. So there would be food production and, enough, leather hides, I suppose, for army boots and that. So they weren't really as anxious for the young farm guys to get drafted or join up, I suppose, as some of the city folks who did flock there. I mean, they were volunteering left and right. But it actually was in 1918, so my grandpa would have been, pushing 19, maybe close to 20, that he decided, okay, maybe it was time. Probably was a call came out, and he had said, and so yeah, he decided, he volunteered, and did this boot camp, I suppose, in Camp Petawawa in Ontario. And I distinctly remember him saying, now, I said, Grandpa, what division or what, aspect did you get into? He says, oh, well, they put me in charge of the horses. Horses? He says, yeah. He says, that's how they pulled the cannon and the wagons and, in the war. And, but, okay, yeah. And I says, why? Or, how did they decide? He says, all those city slicks, they couldn't handle a horse. They were getting kicked. They were, they didn't have the wherewithal. But, Grandpa, having grown up with horses, obviously he knew that. And so that was quite something. But from there, and I forget, I think it was about a 6-month training, at least three to four. But I said, then what happened? He says, well, they got their marching orders, and they arrived by train to Toronto, and then they were on the train from there to Halifax to load a troop ship. And they were loaded on the troop ship, setting sail, and that's when the war ended, November 11th. So, this day in history. And so he never saw combat, but, it was a story of great interest. And boy, in hindsight, I often wondered, what might have happened if he was over serving, but it's quite a bad war. The other thing about, it was funny, we were out last night at Fraser's having a great time, and I was speaking to a good friend, Dougie, and he was reminiscing about baling hay, you know, with the square bales in the wagon, and what a tough job, and it made me remember my grandfather. Well, originally he farmed with horses, and they'd pull what's called a hay loader. The horses were hooked to a wagon. The wagon pulled a hay loader, and I would be, you know, holding the reins of the horses, and he'd be behind me with a pitchfork. And as the hay came onto the way, it was loose, you know, no bales then. He would stack it and stack it and stack it, and then when it was full, you pulled it up to the barn, and you know, the horses there would pull it up into the mow and a fork. Anyways, it was an interesting story. But things you remember. One more thing I do remember about that was what's called the harvest. And back then, the farmers cooperated with each other. So they had what's called a thrashing machine. Today it's combines, but back then it was thrashing machines, and you know, your neighbors would come over when it was your turn, and these, you know, the grain was in stooks, was brought in on the wagon and put through this thrashing machine. And there was jobs for everybody. I mean, they were picking stooks up in the fields, the wagons were being driven up to the barn, and, you know, they had to be put onto the conveyor into the thrashing machine. There had to be a guy in the barn scooping the grain back, you know. I got stuck with that job a couple times, man, come out looking like a raccoon. But yeah, that was quite something. But what I remember was not only the camaraderie and the helpfulness, but the food. My God, the women would all be there, and they'd be home cooked. I mean, home cooked pies and meals, and it was just a great memory. But then, you know, combines came in, technology, and things changed. You know, you got your crops in a little quicker with these combines, and a lot quicker, and you didn't need to, you know, have all the neighbors involved, I suppose. But yeah, anyways, technology goes on. Anyways, that was the history of that with my grandfather. And but today, Remembrance Day, it kind of made me think of him, and the influence he had on, you know, both my brother and myself. And he passed in his mid-80s in Guelph, Ontario, and had a good life, and left his imprint on us both, my brother and myself. So again, today being Remembrance Day, I thought it would be nice to remember him, and thank all our veterans, both in Canada and the States, for, you know, their service, and God bless them all. So please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed today's content. It really helps out the channel, and tell your friends. Thanks, folks.